We're back. King Pilled is back again. Welcome, folks. Thank you for joining us. I think it's been like
been
a
a minute.
week. Yeah. Yeah, look at us, man. I got really busy with work and just every single day gets to like late in the afternoon and I'm like, shit, should have done a show today. And then I started getting the tweets. People are tweeting at me because I haven't even hardly been on Twitter either, but I see the notifications come in and people are like, "Hey, like when's King Pilled going to go live again?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, we need to get another show." Fortunately for us,
I had
we
the
are.
AIDS.
Yeah, oh yeah, Cooper had the AIDS as well. He's got a particularly obnoxious form of it. First of all, I forgot to say this. Happy NFL Draft Weekend to those who celebrate. I'm a former passionate celebrant and not so much anymore. I watched part of the first round yesterday while I was doing my work. But so to those of you out there, I know that the circle of people who watch King Pilled and also follow sports closely is a lot larger than it looks, but it's kind of like something to be ashamed of in these here circles. Everyone looks down on those who are the sports ball watchers. So for those of you out there, you have an advocate. I see you. I've got you guys. Sports ball is something that's noble and wonderful and should be encouraged. I would much rather have people just be invested in sports ball and not invested in all of these other things because the vast majority of people, it's not any of their concern. They don't need to think about it. They just need to go follow their sports ball, go to their jobs, make some money, provide for their families, create nice little stable communities, and go about their ho-hum life and not be worrying about whatever is happening in Nigeria or
When I
what have
become
you.
God Emperor, I'm outlawing all sports except for badminton and curling.
See, what you're going to do then is you're going to eliminate a massive source of camaraderie and localist nationalistic spirit, because that's what sports ball properly engaged with. That's what it actually provides. It's one of the most tribalist things out there.
Badminton and curling. Those are your outlets. Those are the only
Well,
sports I like.
Curling's actually a lot more fun a lot more fun to
I
watch
guess
than
maybe
you might think.
skateboarding, if you want to call that a sport. Get people
No,
spray
I need
painting on
my
everything.
baseball in there too. Need some baseball.
Yes.
Oh, you like the boring sports ball.
That's why I grew up playing. So
They're trying to unboring Major League Baseball right now, and they're just destroying it. They're just making everything worse. They're trying to speed the game up, and there's like a pitch clock now. And all of a sudden, with this pitch clock comes a massive rise in pitchers blowing out their elbows because they're trying to keep up with the pitch clock. Anyways, I won't belabor you guys with that rant. That other voice you guys heard, for those of you who are not watching, is Ben Kelleran. Ben, welcome to King Pilled.
thanks for having me.
Hello, Ben.
I think it'll be an interesting conversation. So
Yes, Ben is, as he described himself to me, he's an investor, an occasional degenerate gambler, my type of guy, and he's the author of the Contrarian Corner Substack. Now, the Contrarian Corner, both of those words are spelled with a K, and we were asking just before we went live what the third one is. Where's the third K?
That's his last name.
Yeah, right there it is. So Kelleran's Contrarian Corner. Now he has his right wing internet credibility.
yep.
How's
but
the
Ben-
audio, everybody?
Let's wait for them to answer. We're not going to wait for them to answer because there's like a 20-second delay. If the audio is bad, let us know. As long as it's close enough. You've heard a sample of all three of us now, so as long as it's close enough. Euthanasia says seems good. All right, we're going to just stick with that. Before we start talking to Ben, I just had one thing that I wanted to mention. If any of you, I know we've got a pretty diverse group of audience members out here. The people that listen to King Pilled are a pretty wide-ranging group of folks. So if any of you out there are, I guess, experienced in commercial real estate or want to get involved in something related to commercial real estate, some business partners and I have a thing that we're working on, completely unrelated to King Pilled. And we're looking for someone who might come in as an investor or partner or something along those lines. So if any of you out there are interested in getting involved in a project like that in Central Texas, then just hit me up on screw it. I'll just give you my number, my work number. It's 210-245-0802. Just shoot me a text. Just tell me who you are and shoot me a text, and we can get on a call. We can talk about what the the details of it. So just trying to use the platform that I have to try to facilitate some of the other things that are going on. So speaking of the audience, we obviously have the King Pill Discord server that you guys can join at kingpill.com. We've got a great group of people in there. I absolutely love the dynamic that we have there. I had a guy who he joined the server earlier this morning, and so as he's listening to this, he's going to know who he is. He joined the server earlier this morning, and after a little bit, he sent me a private message, and he asked me, he's like, "Hey, the first thing that I got asked when I joined was I was told that it was penis inspection day." And I was like, "Well, did you present your penis for inspection?" So it's a very fun group. We've got a great group of guys in there, and we're actually more serious than you might think, but we make sure we don't get too serious. So one of the guys who joins us from the King Pill Discord server today is Ben KELLERAN. He came in there and introduced himself, and we started talking, and I ended up having a conversation with him privately, and we were like, "Yeah, we need to get you on the show. This would be a good source of discussion." So he's got some ideas he wants to share with you guys. Again, he's from the Contrarian Corner Substack. So Ben, tell us what the Contrarian Corner Substack is and what you're bringing to the table for us today.
Yeah, so I guess I can start with a little bit of background. I did a year and a half in public accounting at one of the big four accounting firms. So that was a long prison sentence, but learned a lot and basically was overworked and underpaid and have been focused on my investments since then. And so started my Substack about a year ago. And so I'll be writing up deep dives on companies, talking about what's going on in markets, basically following lots of stuff related to commodities and market cycles and other stuff that I think is pretty interesting right now. So I think there's a lot of opportunities out there, but a lot of investors are going to be caught off sides, I think, in the coming years. So that's some of the stuff that I focus on.
So what is it that you in particular are looking at that you think most people aren't? Because if most people are going to get caught off guards, obviously they're not seeing something coming. So what are you seeing coming?
Yeah, so I guess the big picture macro look at all this stuff is you kind of have the debt problem that we had in the 1940s, the inflation that we had in the 1970s, and valuations for most stocks that looks pretty similar to the dot-com bubble. And you kind of line all this stuff up and layer on 40 years of declining interest rates, which I think we're coming out of. And I think we're probably in the early innings of a commodity cycle. So it's a messy picture, but I think there's lots of opportunities out there for people willing to look at commodities which have been relatively out of favor for a long time. So
for the slow boys here, define a commodities cycle.
So
Yeah, I know.
It's obviously not me. I'm just
right.
looking out for everyone else that's listening.
Yeah, right.
So basically, commodities tend to move a little bit differently than your average stock, right? If you own Apple and that's growing for 10, 15, 20 years, that's going to be a good stock to own. But commodities are very cyclical where you'll have these boom and bust cycles. So, right, the price of oil will go up. All these companies will invest in new production, bring on the new production, and then crash the price, and their business is crappy for as long as it takes for them to work through that. So it generally is like a 12 to 15 year cycle. And so the last time you kind of saw that peak was in, call it 2008 to maybe 2014, somewhere in that range, where oil was basically, I think it went from, I think it was like $20 all the way up to like 140. And this was like right as all the real estate stuff was blowing up and everything. But so basically, I think we're coming out of the back end of that last cycle where like 2014 to 2020 was basically a complete disaster. And across the sector, they were very underinvested in as far as oil, coal, natural gas, all these different things. And so now it looks like a good time to be looking at the sector. So there's also other commodities like Whiteboard mentioned, which are gold and precious metals, or orange juice, or cocoa, which has basically shot the moon in the last, call it 3 or 4 months. But
are you telling me that you track the stock price of cocoa, or not the stock price, but the valuation of cocoa?
Well, you can. I think it's gone from. Let me pull it up here. I think it's gone from like 1,000 to like 10,000. And
I love that I know someone who knows the price of cocoa right now. Because when you talk commodities, you're basically it's like raw goods, right? Like raw, like
yeah,
unprocessed, whatever the good is, whether it's lumber or wheat or what have you.
yeah. So cocoa basically went from 4,000 a ton all the way up to 12,000 in 4 months. So
So
that's
what would cause a run up like that?
so for commodities like that, it has a lot to do with weather and crops. And I think there was a disease there. So basically, um, big time supply shortage, and everyone's scrambling to get their hands on it or speculate and trade in these markets. So there's a lot of different things that impact these markets, but it's an interesting place to be looking at. So
So you said one of the first things you brought up that we should discuss for context is really like the big picture of everything that's going on right now. The big picture economically, politically. What are like the major indicators that you are seeing that make this a unique time, and what's your unique take on them?
yeah, so I guess one of the things that you kind of hear about in different news articles and people complaining about, oh, it's impossible, I'm never going to own a home, this and that. Like you do have wealth
me.
inequality. You do have wealth inequality basically at like all-time highs. You've got housing affordability pretty much at all-time lows, and you kind of have this setup where a lot of things that people look at as like, hey, I want a piece of the American dream, the white picket fence, the house, the family and kids and all that. It's basically a lot of people view it as out of reach. But when you look at a lot of these markets, all these things move in cycles. And so I think we're kind of at a big time turning point for a lot of these things where it looks like a mess now, but 5-10 years out, I think things are going to be heading in the right direction.
So okay, so for example, housing. This is something that working in real estate, I am pretty close to. And I was actually just talking to someone yesterday. We were talking about housing prices, and I said, just to me, it was almost weird to kind of think about this. This person's looking at buying, and they were expressing concern at the idea of like housing prices not going up. And like if I buy into this, am I going to wind up losing equity over the next few years? And in particular, we're talking in like the greater Austin area. And I'm like, no, like you're not gonna be losing if you're talking about buying something right now in the greater Austin area, just a single family home that's in a nice neighborhood that is right in the expansion ring, that is in good condition, and you take good care of it. I don't see any possible way in which the cost of housing is going to appreciably decline on average over the next 10 years. So what is it? And obviously, like Cooper says, there's a lot of people who are making this sort of analysis. This is why a lot of young people are so like disenchanted with the idea of ever even owning a house. It's like this is just never going to be accessible to me because the cost to get into it is going to keep climbing. Even if in nominal terms the prices don't go up, the cost of getting into them is going to go up. So what are some of the things that are driving that, and why do you think what are you projecting with that?
So I think actually for a lot of major markets, it's going to get more affordable at some point in the next 5 years, not less. But you do have to kind of factor in what it costs to build these things. That's basically going to be a floor on housing prices. But you have basically, if you look at the boomer generation, which is rightly vilified for a lot of reasons, but I think over the next, call it 10, 12 years, there's going to be something like 9 million homes hitting the market from them passing homes down and those homes getting sold off. So you kind of have a lot of new supply basically waiting, and it's not going to happen all at once, but over time, that's going to be something to watch out for. But I think too, when you look at like the income to like price ratios for homes, we're basically close to all-time highs. Like if you look at any major metro and you're not trying to live out in the middle of nowhere, like you're pretty much anywhere from 5, 6, 7 times. If you're in California, you're like 10 times like price to income. But like you go back to when the boomers were buying houses, it was basically 2.5, 3 times. So a lot more affordable. And one of the funny things about boomers, this is if you have a conversation with any of them on real estate, they'll always say, "Oh, when I bought my house, my mortgage was 14%," and they'll never like make the connection that basically the price to like what they paid was way lower compared to their income. So I think it's
Right, like they might have been paying 14% on the mortgage, but it was like a $30,000 house, and their actual purchasing power was much higher relative to that because everything else didn't cost so much.
well that and I mean, if you kind of look at like even these are even in like prime areas, you're basically looking at, okay, if your annual salary's 10,000 or like 15,000, then the $30,000 home, like even if you're paying a high interest rate, that's not like you could pay that off relatively quickly.
Mhm.
Whereas right now, like median income is, call it 60,000, I think last time I looked, and you can't really get a home in any of these cities or suburbs for like less than 400,000. And I mean, it depends on where you are, obviously, but you're looking at something where it's like, okay, like even if the mortgage rates are low, which they're not as low as they were 2 or 3 years ago, then you're still going to be basically hosed compared to where the housing market was, call it 30, 40 years ago. So
Right. Yeah. A 3% rate jump on a $400,000 house is a lot more expensive in like wage terms than a 3% jump on a $30,000 house.
yeah, so I think it'll be interesting to watch, but I think interest rates are actually going to be headed higher over the next,
Mhm.
call it 5 years. And I know that's generally problematic for real estate, but we'll see. You kind of have these two competing forces where either you need rates to come down and the prices can stay where they are, and then affordability gets a little bit better, or you'll have rates going up and then the price, either all these people get priced out, or the price has to come down significantly. So I think it's an interesting turning point to be looking at for something like real estate. So
And a lot of this, I think, is you pointed this out. A lot of this is going to be pretty market specific as well, because you can look at broad population trends, and then you can just kind of think about the broader geopolitical picture, and recognize that places, I mean, really, like deep blue cities, deep blue regions, are going to get worse and worse in across like all sectors. And that's going to drive a flood of people. It already is driving a flood of people away and into new sectors. Well, if you get increased demand in those sectors, it's going to drive up prices. So then someone has to come in and they have to supply that demand. But that's sort of, I think this transition that we're looking at is happening so quickly that it's taking people a while to recognize there's a whole bunch of new opportunities, not just in real estate, across all different industries. There's a whole bunch of new opportunities that are opening themselves up. So you just have to look in the correct market and in the correct sector in the correct market, and you have to have the right people there. So I think a part of this, you recommended today this title, which I think is fantastic. The American Dream is Dead. Long live the American Dream. So this sounds like this is kind of a you're saying we're hitting this tipping point where it's like the American Dream is dead, and yet in a certain way, the American Dream is actually not dead. Is that what you're saying?
I would say it's gonna take some time for a lot of stuff to basically work its way through the system. But I kind of view like politics, markets, culture, like all these things tend to move in cycles. And I think we're kind of at one of those turning points where you basically have all these things lining up, and it's going to get either it gets very messy and we're not going to be like debating real estate, or real estate gets more affordable for a lot of people. So I think like you just look at like what a home is priced at right now, where like I'm out in Boise now because I escaped Seattle, but like it's 450, 500,000 for a decent house, and
Because everyone else
the
escaped Seattle too,
yeah,
and
Seattle
California.
and California and Oregon.
No one cares about Oregon.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. You look at a place like Portland. I remember going down there when I was little. It was very different than it is today. But yeah, you kind of have the setup where the problem with why this is going to take so much time is that you basically have a huge chunk of the housing market that is locked into, call it three, like basically very low mortgage rates. And so, right, if you have that 3% mortgage, that was basically the trade for every homeowner, where it's like, okay, now I'm locked in and I'm not going to move if I'm at 2.5%, 3%, because you have inflation, you have all these other factors. And it's like, if I have to move and my new mortgage rate is going to be 7%, it's like, that just doesn't pencil out for a lot of people. So you're going to need to see a lot more transaction volume for real estate to start clearing and the prices to get more reasonable. But I think, like I said, with more housing supply coming from boomers passing on and other areas, I think you're going to get more affordable real estate by, I would guess by the end of the decade, but I would say probably three to 4 years. So,
This is we didn't do this on purpose at all, but this just segues absolutely perfectly into the precise subject that has completely dominated my mind over the past, I don't know, 3 weeks or month or something like that. I've mentioned a guy named Pace Morby. I keep saying his name wrong. Pace Morby. Look him up on YouTube. Someone who's in this type of situation where you have like you're locked into a 3% rate and you want to move, but to move you're gonna have to sell your house and buy a new house, and you're gonna be, like massively increasing your monthly cost through an increased interest rate. There are solutions. There are things that you can actually do. You got to look for the right house and the right seller. But there's two different very interesting techniques. One of them is pretty familiar, called seller finance, which you're basically just asking the seller to become the bank and sell their home to you on terms. The other thing is something called subject to, which is I'd been in real estate for a couple of years now and never even heard of it. And it turns out that subject to is actually, like, it's been around for forever, and you can do it. You can buy things subject to. It's subject to existing financing all over the place. So someone who wants to transition from a low interest mortgage to another low interest mortgage, you can look for somebody who you can take over the payments on their existing mortgage. And I think being able to bring there's this broad section of things called creative financing. We need our guys to become fluent in creative financing, because if you know how to use creative finance, then we can actually be the people who are the kingmakers through this transition. Like, imagine if you could use this opportunity to pick up a bunch of real estate, and you don't have to have a ton of money into it to begin with. You just have to have a plan. You have to know how to use it, and you have to predict the trends that are coming in the market. This is something we've been talking about in the King Pill Discord, because I think there's a tremendous number of opportunities out there, and it doesn't just have to be real estate. You can buy businesses using creative finance. So a lot of these old boomers who don't want to sell their business because, like, they're not going to have an income if they sell it, or they're afraid of the tax consequences, or they just, for whatever reason, they won't sell. You might be able to give them a really powerful financial incentive to sell. So all these boomers who are just sitting on all this wealth, we can get our guys to go make compelling offers to them to turn that wealth over, because it's going to get turned over to someone. And my suspicion is, and you could correct me if you see different here, but my suspicion is that a lot of the boomer wealth that gets passed on is going to be scooped up by corporate interests through one mechanism or another. In part because there isn't going to be the retail demand for it, because everyone is completely strapped, like cash strapped, credit strapped, whatever it is. And just because they're the ones who are watching these sorts of trends. It seems like there is an institutional recognition that we're at a significant tipping point of some kind. Do you agree on that?
yeah, I guess it kind of depends on the asset class that you're kind of passing down, right? So it's a lot easier to pass a portfolio of stocks and bonds down to your kids than it is to deal with a small business that your kids don't want to run or have anything to do with. And that's where I think you're more likely to see the private equity vultures start to come in and look at opportunities there. And there's a book I still have to read on that, but basically the way those companies work is they basically strip mine these companies and get as much cash out of them as they can, lever them up, and then resell them and kind of basically play this game of musical chairs. But I think it kind of depends on the asset class, the situation, but I definitely think you're going to see institutions looking to play in kind of the boomer wealth transfer. So
What are some of the other cycles that you're looking at? You mentioned before how there's like all these different cycles, and some people look at some of them, some look at others. Doesn't seem like everybody looks at all of them, and all of these cycles basically look like shit. They look very foreboding. What are some of the other cycles that you're looking at, and how are you reading them?
yeah, I think some people call it the fourth turning. There are other kind of theories on that, but I think the biggest one that looks really interesting to me right now is oil specifically, and that's basically the king of all the commodities. That's the lifeblood of the economy. That's what everything runs on. And I think you have a pretty interesting setup for call it the next 5 to 10 years, where we basically have underinvested in a huge chunk of that sector, and there's certain subsectors there that I think are very attractive. So one of the other places I like to look is the coal sector, believe it or not, where that's been vilified and people think it's the dirtiest form of energy and this and that. But we basically haven't added any significant amount of production for, call it 10, 15 years. And we basically are hitting record demand for coal every year. So like 2023 was the highest year for demand on record for coal. 2024 is going to be the same. It's basically continuing to grow. And you have places like China and India and Southeast Asia that basically are going to continue to build coal plants and require it for steel. One of the things that some people don't know about coal is like 70% of the world's steel production relies on coal. So it's not something where it's going to go away anytime in the next 10, 20, 30 years. Like a lot of these businesses have a long runway and they're basically priced like they're going bankrupt in 3 to 5 years. So that's one of the sectors I find really interesting.
Tell me what you think about windmills.
That is the epitome of fake and gay energy, as I like to call it. But yeah, I think solar and windmills, it's basically a massive grift for subsidies. So
Yep.
you've kind of got all these incentives that, like the quote is, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And you look at something like solar or wind, and they would not get built just based on how much energy they produce if it wasn't for like tax subsidies and all the other stuff you kind of see. Plus they're an eyesore, man. They're ugly. I can't stand them. So
If they were making like the old like wooden Dutch windmills, maybe it'd be a little different. But they're these big, like sleek egg-looking things.
Well,
Go ahead.
I was gonna say too, like the thing that a lot of these people that are on the like climate change bandwagon for energy, that like these things don't just like fall out of the sky and show up. Like it takes like a massive amount of raw materials and transport costs and all these other things to basically get them up and running. And then like we're gonna end up with like landfills full of like solar and windmill blades, and it's just a mess. It's completely it's just bad investments for short-term tax gain for a lot of these utilities and wealthy investors, and it's a mess. It's a mess.
Future archaeologists are going to dig those up, and they're going to think that we were like building idols to some sort of wind god or something.
It is basically a religion at this point, like the climate change and ESG and all this other stuff. It's is bad. So
I foresee a dystopian future where I am driving north on 127 in mid-Michigan, and I start going through Alma, north of St. John's, and there's that hour-long stretch where there's nothing but those fucking windmills everywhere, and they're all gonna be just standing there, like, still, not moving, and rusting.
Moss
And-
hanging off of them.
Yeah, yeah, like birds and shit, like building nests. There'll be monkeys swinging from them.
yeah, my personal
Dump
favorite.
it in the ocean. Dump them in the ocean.
Yeah, send them to India or something. We'll figure out something to do with them. But
Yeah,
the
right.
Cheap housing.
the one of my favorite headlines I saw in the last couple months was like one of the solar farms. I think it was actually down in Texas that got hit with a hailstorm, and it basically like a lot of these projects. They basically when they plan them out, it's like, oh, this thing's gonna last for 20, 30 years, which is like good luck with that estimate. But when you get hit with a hailstorm in year 2, it's like everyone's basically shit out of luck. So it's
Texas hail can fuck you up.
yeah.
We had grapefruit-sized hail like 40 miles from us just recently. I mean, like that's like a hailstorm that would kill you if you're out walking around. So I'm just imagining this this whole farm of windmills, and they're just like a whole bunch of puncture marks in all of them.
Yeah. No, it's funny to look at because if you wanted to like wave a wand and actually fix the problem, you'd be looking at like nuclear power and specifically thorium, like dry salt reactors. It's a technology that's worked in, I think it's been around for 60, 70 years. But we basically went with the light water reactors because that's what you need to build nukes. So, but I think the energy density for thorium is actually better, and the dry salt reactors are safer for like baseload energy capacity. So, but that's going to take 10, 15, 20 years. I think it really doesn't get going until you see a lot of the boomers in politics start to cycle out and people realize like, hey, we're going to need a better grid, especially if we're going to go down the artificial intelligence and increase power demand and all these different things where like the grid's not going to be able to handle the load for that, and electric vehicles, which is another scam. And you go down the list and we're basically working our way into a pickle that's going to be hard to get out of. So
There was a thing I heard in a recent Peter Thiel interview where he said if all the major oil companies in the world all got together and agreed to price out all of their competition so that they could raise the price of oil, this would be identified like on its face as the very definition of an illegal cartel. And there would be a hue and cry everywhere about it. But he said, what happens when all of these oil companies fund and sponsor activist groups to ask for ESG and DEI sorts of regulations that increase the cost of doing business, that price out their competition, quote unquote, naturally through the market, so that then they can raise the price of oil. He's asking it, rhetorically, that it's essentially saying that's what's happening.
yeah, I think part of the thing that's interesting about oil is like you're basically constantly reinvesting in the business. You have to find new deposits and drill them, produce them, do all this stuff for transport. And I think there's some aspect of companies wanting to basically protect their business. So like you see Walmart and Amazon having boom times during COVID because all the small businesses had to shut down. And so like you said, the regulations do benefit the big players in any industry. But I think the bigger problem they're going to have is they basically haven't invested in exploration and production outside of the Permian Basin in Texas, which I think is probably set to peak as far as production in the next couple of years. And that's going to set off a whole bunch of alarm bells for oil markets. So that's one of the things I think will be a catalyst for much higher oil prices in the next couple of years.
I've said before that, that there's a lot of people that say, so leaving aside the question of whether or not electric cars are a scam, whether they're actually more efficient or cheaper or whatever, leaving aside that conversation, there's a Something just happened, changed with the audio, Cooper. It just like, I think it's on your end. We got a lot more background noise.
That's because my family's home now. I'll mute.
Oh. The what was I saying? What were we just talking about? Oil.
Setting aside whether or not.
The electric cars. Yeah, electric cars. So one of the arguments I hear from a lot of people, they say, "Oh, I'll never buy an electric car because they could hack into it, or they could lock you in it and drive you away, or there's all these different things that could go wrong with it." And the reason I'm not going to drive an electric car is because I want to be able to put gas in it and be able to have full control over it and everything. And I'm like, unless you're buying a car that was made in like the 80s, then number one, they can hack into it. They can do all kinds of stuff to it. And I think that there's a much more likely future where, like, people say, "Oh, I don't trust the electric grid and I want to be able to drive if the electric grid goes down." Well, if the electric grid goes down, you having a gas vehicle over an electric vehicle isn't going to do very much for you. And secondly, I think it's much more likely that the electric grid doesn't go down and the price of oil absolutely moons. And it's like $20 a gallon to drive a normal to buy gas for a normal internal combustion. So to me, I don't care either way. I want to be able to drive the thing that's going to allow me to drive no matter what the situation is, and gives me the greatest possible opportunity of being able to do that. So I'm inclined to say my personal opinion is that the electric cars are probably safer than the internal combustion engine cars. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, at least until you get
You're
in an
wrong.
accident and then the battery fires start. But no, I guess the thing about the path we're on is we basically have, like, we're stuck between a rock and a hard place as far as energy policy. And if you wanted to build a whole bunch of nuclear reactors, yeah, that is true about electric cars. But if you wanted to build a whole bunch of nuclear reactors and basically build out the grid, then you could argue, okay, like, then we should be moving to electric vehicles. But we don't have the commodities to make the batteries. We don't have any of the stuff that we'll need. Like, if you look at copper, that's another one that we're going to have a huge deficit for. And I think that's up 20% in the last 3 or 4 months. And that's just the copper price. And so a lot of the companies that mine copper are actually interested in them and starting to look into some of those. But you basically don't have the commodities to have, like, everyone driving electric vehicles. And it's going to be one of those things where, like, the more strain we put on the grid with artificial intelligence and data centers and all this other stuff, then it just gets more unrealistic. Where, as with oil, it's like, yeah, I think we're probably going to be looking at $100 a barrel sooner or later, and then maybe 5 years down the road, like over 200. But it's it's hard to predict exactly where it goes, because
where does that roughly translate to gas prices?
So that kind of depends on, like,
obviously there's a lot of variables involved in that, but
yeah, the biggest variable is, like, refining capacity. So you'll see, like, right now, gas in California is way more expensive than other places just because of regulations, taxes, refining, all these different things. But I would say if we're looking at, like, $100 a barrel in the next couple of years, you're probably, like, across the country, $4 to $5 a gallon, I would guess, somewhere in that ballpark. It's really hard to say if we go to, like, 150, 200, like, down the road, where, like, there are just a lot of moving pieces with that. But I would guess at some point in the next 10 years, we're going above $10 a gallon and probably not looking back. So,
what about LNG?
That's an interesting question. I think we're, like, right now, we're basically in a supply glut for natural gas where, like, we have plenty of it here. Europe doesn't have a whole bunch because someone in their infinite wisdom decided to blow up the pipeline from Russia. But I'm sure that was well thought out in advance. But anyway, the problem with LNG is you basically, with the export facilities you have to build that cost billions of dollars, the ships that aren't cheap, and all these different things you have as far as cost, and then but I think you lose something like 20 to 25% in the like liquefaction process. So basically you have to, like, it's a pain in the ass to transport if you're not using pipelines. And so you're like, it's just not going to compete with Russian gas for Europe or other places and other pipelines. Like right now, Russia's building pipelines to China for natural gas. So I think, like, longer term, I have a hard time believing that we're just going to be shipping a whole bunch of natural gas all over the world to make all this stuff work. So, but the U.S. is definitely a way better situation than Europe. I think Europe is toast over the next 5-10 years. So,
Oh yeah, for a whole bunch of reasons. It's like this one thing that's kind of interesting. We did an episode a few weeks, actually probably several weeks back now, where we talked about like the difference between the European consciousness and the American consciousness. Where America obviously has been kind of it's a descendant of Europe, but it's seeming to me more and more clear that these are two completely different entities, the American consciousness and the European consciousness. There's a derivation there, but the American one is quite different. And I think broadly over the next 10 to 20 years, what we're going to see is the real clean departure of these two. And I think a lot of the really doomer, pessimistic, exceptionally nihilistic sentiment that you see among Americans is evidence of them still being attached to the European consciousness. It's kind of like getting them by osmosis or something, because one of the things that really differentiates the Americans from the Europeans is the kind of like adventuresome, risk-taking, bold, arrogant. But like by there's a natural selection effect here, because those are the people who were inclined to go from Europe to America and reproduce and colonize the North America, and then you get that generational, I guess, distillation of that selection, and that's really what made America. And I think that adventuresome, conquering the Wild West spirit is still in there, and I think it's naturally beginning to rear its head as Europe is really beginning to go under. And so then there's like a parasitic relationship between Europe and the United States right now, which I think the United States, it's not like Europe has just trashed themselves and the United States has been just wandering around on the sidelines. There's been an active participation, but these are also just kind of the natural cycles as you go through the death of an empire and the birth of a new one. Because I do believe that we're coming into the birth of the American empire. We're not anywhere close to the death of it. We're experiencing the turmoil of the birth pangs of it. Is that something that would square with what you're seeing?
yeah, so I think as far as Europe goes, I think we're probably going to see the European Union fall apart in the next 10 to 15 years. And like,
Why is that?
Basically it's just unnatural the way they've kind of grafted it together. And when you get periods of conflict, like you're going to have too many different factions that are fighting over different agendas. That's kind of the short version. The long version is takes a long time to hash out, but basically the European Union, like the euro is a currency. Like I think all these countries are realizing like, hey, it's a bad idea to hand over like sovereign control to unelected bureaucrats that can basically create these different agendas and try and dictate what their policy should be. And so like as bad as immigration is here, like you look at Europe and like they're basically, I would say 3 to 5 years ahead of where we are now. But I think here in the US, like you said, I think we're looking at a process where like the setup we have right now, this will piss off boomers again, but like we have the so-called constitutional republic, but I mean, it's really just an oligarchy kind of wearing that as a skin suit right now. But I think in my lifetime, we get something closer to a monarchy or empire. Like you have centralized control and like one person is like the guy and so you know who's responsible. And if he basically does stuff that like you'd see now, like his head would roll. So I think you're gonna get something like that in our lifetime, but when that happens and the path to get there is messy. So it'll be interesting to watch. And I'm definitely excited to not have to deal with what we have now. I think a lot of the political situation right now is basically a complete mess. So, and we're not even halfway into the election year. I think that it's only gonna get more crazy from here. So,
yeah, this kind of part and parcel with my my thesis of this being the beginning of the American empire, and not the end is. I would say I would wager within the next 50 years or so that the American empire is going to be much stronger and more evident as itself than it is today. And the seat of power in the American empire, whether it's formally the capital or not, the actual seat of power is for the American empire is going to be in Texas. I don't know exactly where in Texas, but it seems to be where there's so much economic activity moving here, and there's so many reasons for it to come here, and there's so many resources and so much access to resources and so incredibly much space here that for political reasons, for economic reasons, you're going to see a lot of big business moving its operations here and operating out of Texas, while at the same time you also get the Northeast with a much denser population, overwhelmingly controlled by regime loyalists, is just going to turn into a complete shithole. All the high value people are going to be getting the hell out because the infinity immigrants and crime, unrestrained crime, and urban scholars taking over the blocks. Nobody's going to want to live there. Nobody who's high value at all, which correspondingly then should tell you where is the economic opportunity going to be? The economic opportunity is going to be wherever all of the rich people want to go to escape whatever they're trying to escape.
Yeah, I think I can't remember who I was listening to, but they were talking about how we're already kind of seeing this sorting after COVID, where it's like you kind of look at what's happened over the last several years, and if you had a chance to move and a reason to move, that was it. And so that's how I ended up in Boise. A lot of people moving to Texas, a lot of people moving out of California. And so I think you're kind of continue to see that, where you'll see this continued sorting. And as far as certain places that would not want to be, you look at the Northeast, you look at areas around DC, you look at all these different things. I think they're going to continue to have these similar problems that they've been having so far. So I think at least until they bring in the riot squads for pro-Palestine protests or whatnot. But I mean,
I heard I haven't been paying attention to the news, but I think I saw a headline where it was an Orrin McIntyre tweet maybe, where he said that they could have been putting down the BLM riots with ease at any point, and they just chose not to. You see their priorities.
Yeah, well, I can't remember who it was, but they were saying the solution to the migrant crisis is just telling Border Patrol that they're crossing the border with copies of Mein Kampf or something. And so it's just like we live in this sort of like clown world where it's like we all see what's going on and we all see what their priorities are, and it's just kind of this situation where like I think we're all kind of waiting for someone to say something and do something about it. But I mean, you look at what's going on in the Middle East right now. I think it's a mess. It's a mess. So
what are you, as you're surveying this and you feel like there's stuff you're looking at that other people aren't seeing, what are you doing to position yourself to take advantage of this transition point, whether on, on a spreadsheet, or in real life, or not in real life, but you know what I mean.
Should I take my entire life savings, pick a shit coin at random, and invest it all in there?
Well, that would be
my
financial or something else.
Well, as my financial advisor, Mr. KELLERAN, I would like you to advise me.
Yeah. I guess the question is like, what's your time horizon? What are you looking for? But at least for what I do, I try and buy something for 3 to 5 years, and that's based off like a fundamental view of where I think we're going. And so the as far as oil goes, like there's stuff where you can basically lean towards dividends, or you can lean towards stuff that's more speculative. But if you're generally bullish on oil, then it could be as simple as, hey, I'm going to go like buy Chevron and Exxon and then forget about it because they'll do pretty well. But there's other sectors like the offshore companies where they've been basically left for dead, and they're, I think, in for a long cycle over the next 5-10 years. So that's what I've
Why
been
is
focused
that?
on. So basically, the way the way I describe it is you've got onshore production, and that's like shorter cycle. So like it takes 3 months to get like a well in the Permian producing. So it's very quick. It's like, hey, oil's up at $90. Let's bring this well online. Whereas getting a offshore like oil field project online takes 3 to 5 years, if not longer, and billions of dollars. So like I think one of the big discoveries down in Guyana, and that's Exxon owns a large chunk of it, and I think they started investing down there like 10 years ago. And so like now they're getting into production, but it's very expensive and takes a long time. And so like these long cycle projects, they're a little bit different, but the service providers, they're basically um, coming out of like a trough in 2020 where a whole bunch of these companies went bankrupt. And so like too much debt, they basically made too many boats or deep water rigs and all these things that you see in that part of the sector. And so there's been consolidation and all these other things going on, but you basically have the setup where there's not any new supply coming online, and to get new supply coming online, the rates would have to go way, way higher. And so they have like the fixed assets already in place, and they're basically valued at, I would say, anywhere from 30 to 50% of replacement costs. So you kind of have a long cycle setup, whereas it's harder to guess what a producer would look like versus like a onshore oil field service company or a pipeline company. I did own a couple pipeline companies a couple of years ago, but I've kind of shifted my focus to some of the offshore stuff. And then I do have a couple South American energy companies that are a little bit spicy as far as political risk, but they're very, very cheap. So
Is that long on ramp, or I should say, how much of that long on ramp time is a product of regulatory compliance, and how much of it is just sheer logistics, like physical logistics?
so it obviously depends on where you're operating, but I think it really is mostly due to how long it takes to explore, right? Find a prospect. All right, is it economic? Like you go down the list, it's like you're gonna basically put billions of dollars into a project before you get a drop out of it, and it's gonna be years. So I think I mean, you have to get all the regulatory stuff sorted, but it's something that is more just the logistics of it that's an issue. So you kind of have, like I was talking about with the with the cycles, you have, I think we're basically in the second or third inning of what could be a very long bull market for the offshore services. And if you get oil going where I think it's going to go, then they're basically going to be in high demand, and there's not going to be any new supply coming online. So that's kind of the thesis there. But I think basically, I think if you own big producers, like big companies that are diversified, you're going to have a better time owning that than like S&P 500 or tech stocks or stuff like that. Just because I think you look at the valuations, that it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So,
So what's your, outside of the investing, like what are your long-term goals? What are you trying to Like, are you trying to make a bag through investing and retreat into the mountains and make babies, or are you trying to get up to like buying companies and beginning to do this stuff yourself? Like, where are you trying to do?
Yeah, so longer term, definitely want to have a small army of kids to take over a local government, but
Making babies.
we'll see. We'll see how long that takes if I can find one worth keeping. But um,
Look at this face,
the
ladies. I know there's not many of you out there, but look at him. He's got the hair. He's got a brain.
at least a
Yeah,
couple
how many-
brain cells to rub together. But
How many chicks do we have here? I see Kate. Kate, do you have like a sister or a cousin or something?
but I guess as far as like business plans, longer term, if I'm right about kind of the offshore and oil and coal and some of these things that I'm invested in, then it's basically going to be a matter of just don't screw it up. And if I'm right about that, then the Substack will probably do pretty well as well. So the Substack doesn't pay the bills yet, but it's the way it's been growing, I'm pretty optimistic that it will be by, I don't know, end of this year. So as far as like longer term business plans, there's a couple ideas I have rolling around, but it's I like to play that close to the vest as far as what I want to do. But some interesting ideas with real estate, some other ideas that are we'll have to see what happens in the banking sector. But I think there are some interesting ideas I have to basically do some things to change the way banking works. But that's going to take a whole bunch of money and a whole bunch of time. So,
Well, if you're looking at getting into real estate stuff, I might know a guy for you. There was a conversation I had recently with a guy named Phil Gibson on Twitter, and he's friends with Tom Luongo. They have this thesis about the American commercial banks and them and the Fed essentially working in tandem to freeze out Europe, largely speaking, and essentially sort of retrench American financial interests around American interests. What have you been tracking any of this or following along with that, or do you have any thoughts on that?
yeah, I think I guess I will say I do subscribe to Tom's Gold, Goats, and Guns Patreon, and if you're even a little bit interested in markets, you should subscribe. It's way too cheap for what it's worth. I mean, it's a really good service, and I guess the way I look at it is you have basically when all these people agree that, hey, let's just have zero interest rates and do all this stuff to basically juice the economy longer term, then they're all on the same team and they're all basically skimming off the top. And now they're kind of realizing that it's not going to be like they're kind of fighting with each other is the way I see it. And Europe is definitely kind of the sucker at the table. So I think when you look at the US dollar and what we're doing with interest rates, like I would not be surprised if interest rates are actually higher by the end of this year. And everyone's been talking about a cut. And I think if you look at what's happening with inflation and where that's going, I think that more and more people are going to realize like that it's not something like the genie's out of the bottle as far as inflation. And there's not like, we're not going back to like 1-2% like we were 5-6 years ago. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to say, I think there are people in the U.S. financial system that are trying to basically pump the brakes on the runaway train as far as the financial system, but we'll have to see how successful they are. I guess one other detour that was a big mistake with the spending package, and it kind of got buried with 61 billion to Israel or 61 billion to Ukraine, 28 to Israel, something like that, and then some to Taiwan, is that they're basically setting things up to seize Russian assets to fund Ukraine. And that's it's very short-sighted and potentially something that is going to incentivize other countries to say, you know what, we don't want the US dollar, we don't want your debt. And that's, I think, why you're seeing gold close to all-time highs. So,
So you can see then why it would make sense to me why you would have, how would I say this? I want to say pro-American interests, but that kind of means different things to different people. I mean, people who are Americans who want to continue being Americans and they have American property and American companies and they want to continue operating in those capacities. Why they would see this sort of thing happening and not even have like a rigid ideological bent one way or the other, but be like, we don't want any more of this current regime and the way that it's operating because it's threatening our interests now. They can run through this cause and effect and see where it's going. So then they'd be like, Trump is whatever Trump is to me, but I would rather deal with that devil than deal with this devil. So I'll be interested to see if, obviously, one of the things Trump wants, he didn't like the fact that that Powell kept rates high on him before, and he's been very vocal about wanting to see rates come down because he wants his economy juiced. This is so if when he is elected, he's going to come in and he's going to want rates reduced so that he can goose up the economy and take credit for it. I'll be very interested to see if they can get him on board with the reason why it's a little more complicated than that.
yeah, I mean, it shouldn't be all that surprising with Trump's history in real estate that he likes low interest rates. But,
right.
with Trump, the way I kind of look at it is if he realizes what's good for him, he'll be looking to basically hit on some of the talking points where it's like actually focus on what's good for America, and that's not zero interest rates. That's not like I think people talked about, oh, Powell's going to be gone if Trump gets elected. I mean, we'll see. I don't think that it's something where president can really dictate like, hey, we need interest rates down, because I think you just start to break stuff if that's the case. Like the amount of money that would flow into like hard assets, stuff that can't be printed, if you basically slam interest rates down, it would shock a lot of people. So I think I do think it's when Trump gets elected, though. I think he is going to be the guy. But the way I look at it is like I was having this conversation the other day, and it was basically, do you really think he's going to fix things? And it's like, well, no. Like, there's no voting our way out of the situation. But the way I look at like voting for Trump is you're basically pulling the pin on a grenade, throwing it at Washington, D.C., and hoping something goes off. And that's better than voting for Biden, in my opinion. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the very least, he's like predictably self-interested. And so it's really just a matter of framing the things that you want to him. He's not coming at it from an ideological bent. It's just like framing the things that you want at him from the perspective of, here's how this is going to be good for you. And just make the dude's a businessman. Just make a sales pitch to him. That's part of the downside with him. Is people complained about this during his last administration, that he would be like, someone would go in and they would talk to him and he'd be all on board with everything that they said, and they'd leave being like, great, we've got a deal. And then the next person would come in and they would advocate the exact opposite, and they'd make a really good compelling case to me, be like, yeah, we're on board. And people are like, what the fuck? Like, how do we he's all over the place. Like, to me, this is an asset. Like, I don't care. I don't need him to be ideologically committed to my ends. I want him to be clearly self-interested, and his self-interest is going to align with the things that are good for America as America. So, I think there's still especially within our corners here, there's still a strong libertarian instinct to look for in every single, when you're thinking in like political candidates terms. Like every single time, it's like, okay, this guy's 99% of the way there, but then there's this 1% of things that we're different on, and we're going to turn that 1% of things into the entire conversation. And this just is not how the political system functions, or how you should relate to the political system.
Yeah, the getting caught up on the deal breakers is like very short-sighted, and for anyone that needs to speed run like and graduate from their libertarian phase, just go listen to Pete Canonis, and you'll be
Yes.
you'll graduate quickly. But I think the thing with Trump, and one of the things that you're starting to see, and it goes back a little bit to your PayPal mafia idea, is there's more and more businessmen that are looking at what's going on. They're like, all right, like there needs to be a line in the sand somewhere. Like this needs to stop. And like even in the news recently, and this will never pass, like just knowing what like the financial system is about, like the unrealized capital gains tax and all this other stuff. It's like it's basically the what's the movie? Mad Max, where it's like that's bait.
Yeah, yeah.
It is. It's like they're throwing it out there. It's like the chances that passes is like 0.1% or whatever. Like it's just not gonna happen. Like
You're right.
You look at like who's in the driver's seat as far as like financial system politics is like, yeah, no, not happening. But
For those who don't know what Ben's referring to, there was apparently a part of Biden's tax plan involves implementing a 25% annual tax on unrealized gains and I think it was the 0.01%. So it was basically anybody with a net worth over $100 million. And for those who don't know what that would mean, a 25% tax on unrealized gains would be like if you say you bought a house, and then the house, while you're holding on to the house, owning the house, living in the house, it increases in value, being taxed, having to write a check for a percentage of that increase in value. So you didn't get additional cash into your pocket. You don't have additional liquidity or anything like that. You're writing a check based on the appreciation of the capital that you own. This is and at a 25% rate too. This is like the idea that literally the most powerful, financially influential people in the world are going to agree to something like this. The only way they would is if they had a carve out that they could take advantage of that other people couldn't take advantage of. But now all you're doing is you're just pissing off everybody who's immediately below that threshold, because now they're going to get stuck with the cast off effects of that. So it just shows you where their mind is at, what type of things they're thinking about. And these are the types of things that a 100 millionaire or a billionaire is going to be like, I don't want anything to do with this, because the entire structure of the tax code is such that these people have an incentive to put their money in places like this where they can get capital gains without being taxed on it. Everything they're trying to do is to prevent being taxed on their gains. So to start taxing it is just absolute madness. There would be a complete revolt.
yeah, if they did something like that, it'd be a good time to be like a trust lawyer or someone running like an offshore bank, or someone working with people to renounce citizenship. And I mean, that'd be pretty lucrative. But I just think it's one of those things where it's just not going to happen. Like I just don't see how they would get something through like that. Like especially when you look at even the people in like the House and the Senate with their stock trades, it's like,
right.
Come on, they're not gonna like cut off their nose to spite their face. It's just not gonna happen. So
to me, it's actually kind of a white pill to see them talking about this sort of thing and putting this sort of thing out there, because this is the sort of thing that politically activates exactly the type of people that you want politically activated if your goal is to see the death, or at least the diminution in power of the current regime. This is the sort of policy, even floating this policy out there and suggesting it as a possibility, will light these people on fire. They're like, what are you talking about? Are you completely out of your mind? This is a great way to get all of the 100 millionaires and billionaires, turn them into single issue voters for Trump. Because there's no way he's ever going to sanction anything like that. So like it's an absolute white pill when I see this sort of thing come out there, because if we want defection, elite defection from the regime, this is how you get it. It's a total own goal on the behalf of the people within the regime, and it shows just how incompetent and detached from reality they are. So it changes the conversation from, like, we're not going up against Thanos, we're going up against a drunk toddler waving a running chainsaw around, which isn't a good problem to have. Like, if I have a little kid in my backyard Somehow he wound up drunk and he's waving around running chainsaw. I'm not like, oh, cool, my life's great, I don't need to do anything. There's a whole bunch of ways that this can go bad. But it's not the same as like, oh, Thanos is here and we have to stop him. Like, and that's how I hear a lot of people talk about this. They talk about it as if this is the regime is just this completely unconquerable, inevitable force that is just running us down, and no matter what, they've got some sort of out they're gonna win. There's nothing you can do about it. You just have to sit back and prepare for Mad Max. And I just plainly reject that. What do you think, Ben?
So I think we're basically at a point where all we have to do is just sit back and say no. Like, you don't have to go along with a bunch of these different agendas. Like, I think the whole system is basically at the point where financially or politically, like, it's going to collapse under its own weight just by their mismanagement of it. And like you were saying on the division, like, it's not just like the ridiculous tax policies and DEI. Like, you look at something like Israel and Palestine and like what's going on with Iran and all these different things geopolitically, it's like that's just another issue that's dividing up into these smaller tribes. And you have kind of a situation where there's certain people that are automatically going to be on one side and they have a large influence over our government, but there's also people on the other side. Well, it's like you look at what's going on in Gaza, and I think it's hard to look at that and say, yeah, it's a good thing that we're supporting Israel and what they're doing over there. So I think you kind of have all these issues coming at the same time, and there's not, like, I don't think they can hold the coalition together like the diversity dream team. Like, I don't think that like sticks together. So that's kind of one of the things that I think is worth watching. So
I actually I fired off a tweet the other day that was directly related to this, and I wanted to read it. I was going to do it on the next show, but it's directly applicable to what we're talking about right now, so I'll just do it here. I said, by definition, a state that is openly, I probably shouldn't say that phrase out loud. A state that
cooking
is
the books.
Yes,
cooking the books.
Yes, openly cooking the books on the event that happens every 4 years. A state that's openly doing that is not secure in its power. If it was, it would either not need to do that, or it wouldn't even have those every 4-year events in the first place. This myth of a totalizing autocratic force that has the power to rule with an iron fist, but diddles around playing footsie with silly auxiliary political formulas has never really existed. If one can rule by force, one has no need to manufacture consent. It's massively inefficient to do so versus simply governing through direct violence. I think a lot of people see this the other way around. They think that if you can govern without violence, that it's somehow easier. This is true if you're governing well. If you're governing well without violence, you're secure in your power, then yeah, it is easier. But trying to maintain these elaborate multiple levels removed types of systems is actually really inefficient. It's much more inefficient than simply ruling through direct violence, because it doesn't take very much direct violence to get people to fall into line. The members of the regime have no clear, explicit identity. They don't see themselves as the regime. They see themselves as reactive underdogs, barely maintaining themselves as a bulwark against a horde of faceless, violent white men. They aren't thinking as an expansively secure ruling power, so they aren't going to make decisions predicated upon motivations they don't have. They all move as an amorphous, implicit coalition that only advances through the sheer willpower of its constituents pursuing their individual ends. Increasing opposition forces them to gradually coalesce more explicitly. But then, by definition, the thing that unites them is a negative proposition. The thing that's bringing them together and making them coalesce even more tightly is simply they share a common enemy. These are individually weak, unimpressive, soft people who subscribe to a catastrophically preposterous epistemology. They're literally not capable of maintaining correspondence to reality for a long period of time. They're destined for their willpower to crack and for their coalition to be frittered down to its most self-aware, ideologically possessed core. I think that's what we're seeing happen now. You have to be clearly recognizing your status as the opposition and be, ideologically possessed to do something like suggest a 25% tax on unrealized capital gains. So they're destined for their willpower to crack and for their coalition to be frittered down to its most self-aware, ideologically possessed core, who are definitionally repulsive to like 80% of the population and can only maintain their identity as a minority opposition. So the psychology of this type of explicitly antisocial force that sees themselves, while being in a ruling capacity, sees themselves as the underdog and the victim, like that sort of mentality is just fundamentally repulsive to the vast majority of people. They don't want anything to do with that once they recognize it for what it is. And what's happening is it's becoming more and more clear that that's what it is. And those sorts of people can only exist in a society as a minority opposition. They can't rule and also be a minority opposition at the same time. They can do it for a period of time, but that power is really tenuous and it's going to collapse into something that's completely different. So I think this kind of squares with, let me know if this doesn't, but I think this kind of squares with the thesis you're putting forward, that we're at kind of the crest of some sort of a turning point, and the direction things are going to go is different than the direction it's been going for a while.
Yeah, I think, well, I'm not trying to be an ass here, but while you're reading that long tweet, I was just thinking the TLDR version of this is that they just hate everything that's good, true, and beautiful.
Yes, right.
And I think you look at like the way they look at the world is just like, that's the reason we're going to win. Like, it's fundamentally broken. And I think you look at the way things are set up for the next 5-10 years, it's like, if something can't go on forever, it'll end. So that's kind of, I think, where we're at.
And human beings have a deep, deep desire for the good, the true, and the beautiful. It's something that I mean, if as you progress deeper into there's a lot of people right now that are kind of going through, since COVID and even a little bit through the Trump era, they're having maybe like a spiritual awakening, or becoming kind of like coming spiritually online and beginning to recognize these things that they might, they might attribute it to being something more like metaphysical or something, and not thinking of it in explicitly spiritual terms. But these sorts of things exist. Like the force that draws you toward the good, the true, and the beautiful is there. You can't quantify it. You can't like put it in a box and give it to someone. You can give them something that is good, true, or beautiful, but you can't give them goodness and truth and beauty itself. But they want it. So they're going to go looking for it. They're going to try to find it from someone. And so this is where the people who actually put themselves to the task of delivering the good, the true, and the beautiful to people are the ones who are going to succeed naturally. There are the ones who are going to win out, because the things that are not good, not true, and not beautiful, by definition, will die.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things where you look at like the last 20 years and what's happened from like the DEI stuff to like what's going on in politics, like all these different things. And it's just, it's hard to like wrap your head around how big of a grift it is, but it really is something that if the state wasn't forcing it and subsidizing it and trying to push it on everybody, it just like, it wouldn't happen. It's just unnatural.
I just remembered a question I was going to ask you earlier. It's something that most people don't have a lot of opinions on, but maybe you do. What do you think of, what's your thoughts on Bitcoin?
That's a interesting topic. Basically, I stay away from crypto because I don't think I have any advantage there. But I understand like the fundamental case for Bitcoin as far as limited supply, all these different things. I just don't know how to value it. And there's a little bit of the cult-like behavior of Bitcoin fixes this. And I mean, you kind of see it all over the place, and that's not like, I don't want to be someone else's exit liquidity. So that's kind of one of my investment rules, is like, don't be the greater fool. And there's nothing about Bitcoin where I look at it and it's like, okay, I want to have money invest in that. Even if, I mean, I think it probably goes up from here. I think that's just kind of the way things are going. Money's going to look for where it's treated best. And Bitcoin is obviously done well for a lot of people, but I don't have any reason personally to invest in it when I think I have more of an advantage investing in different stocks and different sectors. And I guess the last thing there too is more like a philosophical thing on Bitcoin, where you look at it and just by the fact that it's man-made, then it's like gonna be broken eventually. And that's, I mean, you can go down the route of like, oh, we're all flawed and this and that, but longer term, it's like no one's gonna come up with the perfect money as far as like something human man-made. And like there's a reason people call gold God's money. So I think that's kind of more of a philosophical look at it, but I don't see, like, I'm not gonna say don't own Bitcoin or anything like that, because I'm not like the Peter Schiff type where it's gold's going to the moon and Bitcoin's going to zero. But I just, for me personally, it just doesn't make sense. So
You got Peter Schiff and Dave Ramsey. They're like they're like the two. I don't know. They like epitomize the boomer perspective on markets and everything.
yeah, they'd definitely be on the Mount Rushmore of like boomer financial talking heads. So.
Yeah, right. Cooper, you unmuted. I could hear you unmute. Were you going to say something?
No,
Okay.
I'm letting the big boys talk tonight.
All right. Well, you ran me out of questions. Did you have any other points you wanted to touch on?
I don't know. I think one of the last things that we kind of skimmed over bits and pieces on was the geopolitical situation.
Oh yeah,
I think that's worth touching on briefly, just because I think there's a decent possibility that we're going to be seeing escalation out of the Middle East and some changes on what's going on in Ukraine. And so for anyone that's familiar with my stuff, like I write about this a little bit, but I basically have found a couple good guys to follow. And one of them has a YouTube. It's Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and he puts out like a video every day on what's going on in Ukraine or the Middle East. And the other one is Meaning in History by Mark Walk, and that's a Substack where it's basically free updates on what's going on, and that's, I think, a really good way to keep track of all this stuff. But I think from some of the stuff I've seen, I think we're like there's an increasing probability that something between Iran and Israel, or Iran's proxies, or however you want to look at it, starts to escalate. So, like, I'm not sure if you guys saw this recent article or post or whatever you want to call it from Pepe Escobar, but he was talking about
the esteemed philosopher Pepe Escobar.
I mean, he is a pretty he's a good journalist and follows a lot of these current events stuff going on, and supposedly confirmed this story with 3 different sources. And I mean, take it with a grain of salt, but there was basically a report saying that an Israeli plane carrying a nuke that was headed for Iran was shot down after leaving Jordanian airspace.
Oh shit.
Yeah, I'll send a link to you, but I don't know if I can put it in the chat or not, but you can maybe drop it in there for me. But basically, and this is all stuff where it's like, I don't know, like there's so much stuff going on as far as propaganda, and it's really hard to be certain on any of this stuff going on. But I think what I am pretty confident on is that Ukraine is basically, they don't have the bodies to keep this going for much longer. I think they're basically, even with the spending package and whatnot, that basically is just money laundering for defense contractors. And I think they're basically done by the end of this year. And a lot of that focus is going to shift to the Middle East, and there's like there are people in our government and people in Israel that seem determined to get into a war with Iran. And I think the chance that happens before the election seems to me like it's been increasing. So It's like I try not to get too far into the weeds because I'm just like, these lunatics are really gonna like try and walk up to the edge and then play chicken or whatever you want to call it. But it's one of those things where it's just like you look at them, it's just it's frustrating. So
well, I know a lot of people will say, you know, they'll point to the U.S. foreign policy establishment and their history with setting these sorts of situations up to take advantage of them, and like but here's the thing, like that playbook is not something that is just restricted to like weird Ron Paul supporters anymore. When Ron Paul talked about that reality, like the whole regime change history of the U.S., people, wow, well, pish posh, whatever. But now that's like mainstream. That's like kind of the mainstream recognition that this is what happens. This is what has happened. This is the way this playbook operates, which means that playbook is going to decrease in effectiveness. This isn't to say that means, oh, well, there's nothing to worry about and nothing that they do is going to work. But it means that, and this kind of corresponds here, that they're going to have to get more and more and more over the top with their machinations that they're putting together to try to make this sort of thing happen, which by definition is going to push more and more and more people away from it because they're going to recognize that the propaganda is propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back in history and look at like the false flags and basically different events in the last 120 years, it's like America has a like tradition of basically lying our way into wars. So
yeah, there's been like 60 or something of them since the 1950s.
I mean, it's just one of those things where I don't see why this would be any different than, I mean, 9/11 or like Gulf of Tonkin. I mean, you can go back and like look at these big events, but it just seems to happen over and over. And so I think a lot of people are starting to wake up to this and realize like what we have been doing is not just like, oh, we're trying to spread democracy and all the other like George Bush taglines, but I think where we're going, there's going to be more people that will be basically on alert, like watching out for this stuff.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on the show, man. This is great.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Enjoyed this. We don't have hard plans on this yet. So, just be on the lookout, but we've talked with Ben about coming into the King Pill Discord and giving some breakdowns on aspects of the market that he's looking at, and maybe doing this on a regular basis, so that we're providing a little extra value for you guys in the King Pill Discord. So we invite you guys to join the King Pill Discord. Join us there. Go to kingpill.com, and we've got my favorite group of people on the internet.
Back,
and Cooper is back. Come to the King Pill Discord, and you can hang out with Cooper and Ben and myself, along with some other people. And then, Ben, where do you want people to find you?
Yeah, so you can check out my Substack at contrariancorner.com. Those are both okays, but I also am on Twitter at Contrarian Corner, and that's a little more of a, I guess, comedic vibe than just focusing directly on markets and current events and all the other stuff we talked about. So
I wonder if you could get, is there a .com, what's it called? Domain suffix?
That would be the triple threat for sure.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, thank you for showing up here today. Do us a favor if you're watching live or if you're watching afterwards on YouTube, hit the like button. We've got 41 viewers right now and 23 likes. So you guys do pretty good, but get those numbers up for us. You can follow me on Twitter at RealKingPill. We're also streaming there right now. Cooper is today. He is not Cooper. I don't know if you noticed this, Ben, but did you see Cooper's name?
I did.
Yeah. Today we were joined by Ben KELLERAN and Ken Bellerin. All right, guys. Thank you for showing up. To those of you who are here in the live chat, and then for those of you who are watching later, thank you to you guys. We'll be back again in the near future. We've got another very interesting interview coming up. I've got to nail down an exact time, but we'll be talking about the curse of Adam and the curse of Eve. We'll just give you a little tease on that. So subscribe to the show if you haven't already, and you can become a member of the channel as well for $5. You can join the King Pilled. So thank you guys for showing up, and thank you, Ben, for being